The situation between India and China. You have to hand it to the Chinese. Their ability to use their $3 trillion reserves to advance strategic interests is unparalleled, some would say. A report in the Nikkei Asian Review claims that China has offered tiny Bhutan a staggering $10 billion in economic assistance. It would include grants, loans and direct investment. Presumably, there was only one condition: to stop siding with India on the standoff with China in the Doklam Plateau. Officially, nobody has come on record to confirm or deny this story. But the Nikkei report claimed that a Bhutanese official contacted Delhi to deny the Chinese offer. Others on the China circuit in Delhi have a slightly different view, though. They say that there have been reports in the past about Chinese efforts to seduce Bhutan with offers of grants and loans. This is not the first time. But nothing has ever come of it. In the present case, though, it could well be that the offer was made informally, perhaps through persons who cannot be directly linked to Beijing. Bhutan, they believe, would not have been tempted since its political and economic strategic stakes in India are enormous. New Delhi provides much of Bhutan's budget, helps build state capacity and guarantees its security and independence. While the temptation to buy into China's offer could be great, Bhutan is aware of the manner in which China swallowed up Tibet, has strong-armed other nations out of the South China Sea and threatens and intimidates when denied its way. China's money also comes at a price. There are many questions in Pakistan over how the country will repay the $50 billion China has committed to invest in the Belt and Road project. Sri Lanka is trapped in debt to the Chinese, owing them billions of dollars, which it is unable to pay back. China has pledged more than $8 billion to Nepal. Kathmandu must first clarify the terms and conditions before signing on. Joining us this evening from New Delhi, Professor M.D. Nalapat. He is a China expert, also associated with Manipal University. Ayanar Thangan, who was also going to join us from Beijing, will be with us shortly. Good evening, Professor Nalapat. Are you surprised that these reports are coming out, and would you put it past China to try to do something like this?
Well, it is very interesting that the Chinese appear to be going back to the traditional way of gaining influence. You know, the Americans and the Europeans under NATO, they basically rely heavily on the military to gain influence in places which resist their influence. Now, the Chinese have always used checkbook diplomacy to achieve the same objective, and they have been extremely successful in this over the last 20 years. So it's interesting to see that the Chinese seem to be understanding that rather than go into an armed confrontation with India, it may be a better option to try and persuade Bhutan to work out an agreement whereby there's a trading of territory. For example, they trade the Doklam Plateau in exchange for some other territory or in exchange for an agreement on the overall border. So I think this is the traditional Chinese policy, and that they have reverted back to a traditional Chinese policy is a very interesting sign, because it indicates that Xi Jinping is in full control of the situation. If Xi Jinping were not in full control of the situation, he would have had to kowtow to the military, and the military in China, frankly, is no different from the military in the United States or the European Union. For them, it's shoot first and ask questions later, and they're champing at the bit to shoot.
How do you see Bhutan's position? Some have said that being a tiny nation sandwiched between India and China, Bhutan can say very little. Whatever it had to say, it has said to New Delhi, and cannot be seen to be provoking China any further. Others say that India is fighting for its cause and Bhutan has kept quiet, and that the silence is suspicious and Bhutan needs the money. How do you gauge the situation?
Well, the fact on this particular issue, Bhutan is the key. The fact is that India went in purely because the Bhutanese wanted it to go in. Now, tomorrow the Bhutanese say that, look, we don't need you anymore, we're working out a settlement, then obviously the position of India becomes untenable. So the key to the situation is actually the attitude of Bhutan. So now the question comes whether the China, with all its riches and with all its ability to influence people through the checkbook, will succeed, or will India, with its traditional alliances, with its ancient ties with Bhutan, will succeed. It's a very interesting geopolitical battle that's now playing out.
And this is not just Bhutan's story, as we also pointed out in our report earlier. China has been doing this, whether it be Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, even Bangladesh. It buys influence. How can India counter this? We know that we've offered to give Nepal $1 billion. You cannot match China's reserves, and yet you want to maintain your influence in the region. What is India's best option?
Well, let me remind you that it's not only Bhutan or Bangladesh or Pakistan that the Chinese are looking in terms of this kind of use of the checkbook. They are, in fact, giving an ample indication to India that they would like to make huge investments in India. Already they have a gigantic market in India in some sectors, such as telecom. They want to vastly expand that market, and it is an expanding market. They want to come into India in a big way in infrastructure, in energy, in telecom. There is some talk of Chinese tourists coming to India in large numbers. You had 110 million Chinese tourists last year. Less than 100,000 came to India. So now that the visa situation is much better, they're looking at 2 or 3 million Chinese tourists coming to India. So they have been looking, frankly, at the same kind of diplomacy with India. But so far, the security agencies in India have held the line and have said that we cannot get too close to China. And the main reason for that, of course, is the Chinese alliance with Pakistan. There is really no doubt that in some time in the future, China will need to choose, in a way, between India and Pakistan. The Americans have made their choice. It's India. In my opinion, if the Chinese are really interested in the national interest, they will make the same choice.
They want to expand their footprint. They want to buy a piece of the Afghanistan pie as well. They're supporting Pakistan. They're saying we were not consulted. So China's ambitions certainly are much bigger than China's ability to do all the things that it wants to do. Having said that, I come back to the Bhutan question, and these are reports that have not been confirmed or denied, interestingly, by anyone. So the question is moot, but do you believe China engaging with Bhutan, or Bhutan rather engaging with China in the near future?
Well, it's certain that the Chinese will be having multiple contacts with Bhutan. They may not be in India, they may not even be in Bhutan. They may be in third countries, countries in Asia, countries in Europe. It could be, friendly countries, so to speak, or countries where the Chinese can do this kind of talk with Bhutan without the Indian agencies finding out about it. There's no doubt about that. So I would regard the story as extremely credible. And if so, I would regard this $10 billion as a starting point, which they'll probably go ahead further, because the Chinese clearly want to do a territorial deal with Bhutan, and they want a deal in which they get the Doklam Plateau, which is of very immense security significance for India, and in exchange probably they're going to be generous on other parts. So I would say the story is very credible.
Einar Tangan is with us from Beijing. Good evening, Einar. We are talking about China reverting to its old ways, offering money to buy the silence or to buy the loyalty of yet another smaller neighbor. This time it's Bhutan. A Japanese newspaper has reported that China has offered Bhutan $10 billion. And this is an attempt to woo it and to try to drive a wedge between India and Bhutan. Your first comments?
I don't think this is a wedge. I mean, if you recall, a few years ago, this was the same deal that was on the table. I don't know how much money was involved or whether it was just aid. Bhutan wanted to take it at that time. India basically vetoed it. Now, what's fast becoming the situation is whether or not Bhutan is a client state of India or whether it has the ability to self-determine. If they want to trade that land, I think that's within their purview. I still believe that China and India must sit down and clarify their border issues. If there are concerns there, I think talking about it is better than sending troops in to sit there and make matters worse.
But India has been saying we should sit down and talk. It's the Chinese who say talks are not possible unless you unilaterally backtrack.
from Beijing's point of view, your troops are there. Obviously, Bhutan feels differently than India does. The question is India going to assert its views on Bhutan? That would be a very serious incident internationally. It does not mean that the simple solution is withdraw the troops, sit down at the table. Whatever Bhutan wants to do, let them do. They're a sovereign nation. Then India and China have to sit down and clarify these issues. But it's not going to be a situation, despite my good friend Dr. Malapat saying that China will have to choose. It could be a situation where India has to choose, and that does not make sense for either. The fact is, I still believe, I think Dr. Malapat agrees, that the relationship between India and China could redefine not only Asia, but the entire world.
Professor Nalapat, another interesting and typically Chinese way of doing things is this: not just the money, but also they've tried to do it with Nepal. They say that India is playing big brother. You take your own decisions. You know, New Delhi is threatening your sovereignty, and Kathmandu should come on its own. And a similar line being taken on Bhutan as well, when he says that is it India's subject state or whatever the term that Einar used. Is that something that China often tries to do?
Well, the Chinese are very versatile in their diplomacy, and as I said, this is now traditional Chinese diplomacy, which was perfected by Deng Xiaoping and is now being carried forward by Xi Jinping. And I repeat, the fact that this is being done, this path is being followed, indicates that Xi Jinping is now in a very strong position. I agree fully with my old friend Einar that India and China must settle the border. And the problem so far has been Pakistan does not want to see India and China settle what is actually a very simple border situation, because the maps are there, satellites are there, global positioning methods are there to indicate very clearly what the border is. But so far, the Pakistan has been blocking China from settling the border. So I fully agree that the border issue must be settled. Secondly, I firmly believe that now we are having a BRICS meeting. In the BRICS meeting, I think there should be a resolution that no country in the BRICS should cross borders or should undertake any kind of warlike action against any of the other BRICS members. There should be a complete peace between the BRICS membership. So I think all this is very important. But the problem in China is that the PLA is far too close to Pakistan. In Afghanistan, for example, the Afghan government is not going to like the fact that Pakistan is urging China to support the Taliban. Even the Russians are now looking at supporting the Taliban, which frankly were very nasty to the Russians in the 1980s in their earlier avatar. So the reality is China must look hard at Pakistan. It has to look at the religious terrorism and Wahhabism that is in that state, and China should not do anything to encourage this kind of Wahhabism, because ultimately it's a monster that will threaten them as well.
Absolutely, and if only we could resolve Doklam in television studios, that would be something, but I'm going to leave it at that.